And the thing is, like, okay, I don't really know where my parents stand, right? I don't know where I stand. And the thing is, there's a lot that we can say, right? There's a lot we can say as a parent. But if I'm not actually acting on those things, it's not going to relay the values that I have. Another example I've seen is, parents sending their kids to weekend school, and it's time for Salat al-Dhuhr, and they're honking their horn, making the kids come and sit down with them. I can see their being excused sometimes, you know what I mean? Like sometimes you have to go somewhere, or sometimes, which is fine. I'm not doubting that they're not praying. But the problem is, if I'm sending this consistent message to my child who just learned about the 5 prayers and the importance of praying and does all those things, and I'm sitting outside getting angry because he didn't come before prayer started, what kind of message am I relaying? Like, the mixed signaling is a problem, and we have to make sure that we are consistent. Our children will pay more attention, and like even us as children, like to our parents, will pay more attention to how our parents react versus what they actually tell us. So it's important to kind of instill those values and understand what those values are. But we still haven't decided or determined, all right, well, what is the hadd of uquq? Like, what does it actually mean? Where have I now gone from being a dutiful, respectful child to be an undutiful, disrespectful child? That stuff is clear, 100%, and I agree, no doubt. And like the moment that I say something intentionally to hurt them, sometimes because of the cultural gap, or sometimes because of a generation gap, there might be, we might say things in a way that is normal for us in our culture. And I always use this example, like, so for those of you who might be from like the Indo-Pak culture, there's a difference in how you respond to your parents in Urdu, right? So a respectful way of responding is ji, and a more colloquial way of responding is ha, right? So they're 2 stages, but they both mean yes, right? They both mean yes. So one of the issues that my parents had is, like, they'd be like, Farhan, I'd be like, what? And they'd be, and how they would translate it? They would translate it as the colloquial way, like, what am I, your friend? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not your buddy. This is not the way that you should respond. And I never understood it. I never got it. And then I realized with my kids, like, when I call them, if they say what, I'm like, hey, I need you to do this. And if they were like, what, then, right? The difference isn't in the wording, it's in the tone. But there's no way to know that unless you're actually, right, in the culture. But I think having that understanding is something that's really important. Understanding the language of our children understanding our language is something that's really important in order to help kind of define, when does it reach disrespect? When is it actually disrespectful? But I think those issues are very clear. Like, what if my parents ask me to do something? What if they tell me to clean up my room or take out the trash, be home by a certain time? Like, how do I define those things? And when does it get to a point where it's like, no, now I have fallen into uquq when it comes to listening to them? Because we talked about blind obedience is to who? To Allah and His Messenger. There's no doubt about that. Saying that, our parents are individuals who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a special position and a special place to care for us, right? And for those of you who are parents, or who aren't parents yet, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you with children, like, through marriage, of course. And like, so like, if, like, going forward as a parent, like, what are some ways that I can help my child determine, like, hey, listen, that this is not an appropriate way to speak to your father or your mother? Or these are things that you have to listen to, and these are things like, okay, we can sit down, we can have a conversation about. So what do you think about things like cleaning up your room? Sure. Capability is something that's really important, right? So if a parent is asking for, yeah, which is okay. I can completely do that. And how much can I delay that?
I mean,
so that's where you have a little bit, not too much, but you have a little bit of room of discussion, right? And you can arrange that and be like, okay, hey, listen, can you just give me 5 minutes? I'm just finishing up my game, or I'm eating. Let me do this. And most parents will be understanding, and they'll be accepting of that. Then you'll have that minority. They'll be like, no, like the moment I finish my sentence, right? You need to move, and you need to fulfill this. Okay, that's good. What if my parents want me to study a particular major? Oh, it got like really quiet.
Are they coming to your school?
I'm sorry? Yes, they are. Or even if they're not, they've co-signed on the loan. Yeah, I mean, I'm saying at the end of the day, yes, you are responsible, but they've facilitated that for you. 50-50? Okay. It's tough, right? It's and this is why it becomes a little bit challenging. But I think that's a reasonable gauge for that. So if I'm fully financing my education, I got a scholarship, for example, I actually have more. I have more say now. Does it mean I should have full say? Why or why not?
I mean, if your parents are kind of recommending instead of forcing, and
Sure.
maybe you're into math and they want you to become something else.
Yeah.
That's obviously.
Okay. So, I mean, and that's the thing, right? So there's a few issues that I think are important to keep in mind. Number one, understanding their intention, right? Parents in general, they want good for us, and also, our parents have something that we don't have, life experience. Right? So when we're really young, we don't have a lot of life experience, and that's something that they do have. And not just that, they've seen us grow. They've seen us grow, they've seen us change, they've seen us act in different environments. So they have not always the best understanding, but at least a good grasp on who we are as individuals. So it should give me more weight to what it is when they have to say something versus what others have to say. And I think that's something that's really important. What if it's a situation like this where they're co-signing? I'm sorry? Right, you do the same thing, and I think sitting down and having a conversation about this is probably the healthiest way to go forward. At the end of the day, like we said, because our parents want best for us, and they haven't. If I sit down and I actually give them a logical reasoning, like, hey, listen, I think this is why this is what we should do, and if they respond, and be like, okay, well, how am I going to tell my friends and family that you're not a doctor? You know what I mean? Like, that's not a logical response to what it is you have to say. If you sit down, you're like, hey, listen, these are the reasons I want to pursue this, or these are the reasons I want to do this. I think many times we make emotional decisions, and in order to help counter that emotion, like emotions aren't bad. Right? Emotions, they're gauges that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that my decisions are as logical and reasonable as possible. So I need to sit down, I need to list them because they're helping me. What if my parents are completely paying for my education? I think it's absolutely. You still have a conversation. There's no doubt about that. That room or that space should never be foregone. And not just that, like parents sometimes will, because of their extreme want for good of them, they'll put them in a position that they're not ready for, right? Or they'll put them on a track where they're not inclined toward that. And it's not always the best path of success for that child. But a lot of this has to do with intent, right? A lot of it has to do with intent. A lot of it has to do with really dealing. But the one thing that we do have control over, both as parents and as children, is the way that we respond, right? Is the way that we respond, the way that we engage. These are things that have to be maintained, and these are the things that have to be controlled. And even if you look at like uquq and like this idea of ihsan and all of these things, it's like, no, you have to be kind, man. Like, be kind, be good. Like, and the thing is, if I can be, and it's not like we don't have the ability to do this. And the reason I say that is because everyone has friends. And if I watch that person with their friends, did they have friends because like they were mean to everyone? And friendship is amazing because it's one of the few completely voluntary relationships we have. Right? I don't need to be friends with this person. I could just walk away one day and be like, no, I don't want to be friends anymore. And I'm sure many have done that when we were like small children, right? But as we get older, it gets a little bit harder. But at the end of the day, it's a voluntary relationship, and we make efforts to actually make that relationship work and put effort into it. We should put efforts into our parents as well. I think that's something that's really important. And are there exceptional cases where they're like either the child is super toxic or the parents are super toxic? Yeah, that happens. But I hope that that's the exception and not the rule. طيب قتل النفس, murder. Murder is always a big one. And even some of the companions, they saw murder as something not being forgivable. Right? Murder is a big thing. What's wrong with murder?
You're talking about unjustified killing, right?
Murder. We're not talking about execution. We're talking about murder. Because that's what's intended. And is execution allowed in Islam? Is the death penalty applicable in certain situations?
Yes.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Okay, what about murder?
Taking the right of an individual which you have.
You have no right to. And not just that. What happens if you open that door?
Everyone can do it.
Right, it's a free-for-all, right? It's just complete anarchy. You're opening the door for bloodshed left and right. And we had talked about many of these major sins, right? Many of these major sins. One of the ideas, so when we think of the Prophet ﷺ, what are two characteristics that we associate most with him, right? There's a lot, right? Like generosity and pious, et cetera, et cetera. But so his khuluq in general, like what are the two that almost everybody shares? The Sadiq and Amin, right? So the two most that are shared, right? Not, and we could go around the room and everyone can come up with their own characteristic of the Prophet ﷺ. Like that's just how amazing a person he was. But the two characteristics that most people share will be that he was truthful. He was truthful and he was trustworthy, right? He was honest and he was trustworthy. And if you look at those two characteristics, they're so important because those are the foundations of society, right? Trust and honesty, right? Like if I can't trust the taxi driver or Walmart or coming to the masjid, you know what I mean? Like if I can't trust any of these spaces, what will allow me to travel? What will allow me to move around? What will allow me to do business? What will allow me to have friendships? Like it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And when we talk about safety, that's part of safety, right? That we can trust the government, or we can trust the police, or we can trust these political systems that are in place for me to get my rights if they're ever violated, right? That's the purpose of a lot of these things. So being trustworthy and being honest, these are two things that are fundamental and foundational to society. And if you look at all these things, if you look at all these major sins, what do they lead to? Right, they lead to breaking that trust. And these, if you actually look at these major sins, they cause societies to fall apart. Lying, which leads to corruption, right? Backbiting, which leads to distrust. Like murder, zina. We talk about why does zina lead to distrust? Right, like intimacy is something. And that's the thing, it's something that's very overlooked. You know, this idea, and the problem is because we live in like a post-sexual revolution mindset, right? And this idea of what intimacy actually is. The problem is, in a lot of Western thought, is that intimacy is what? It's just a physical act. But the reality is like it's a spiritual channel, right? And it's an emotional channel, right? And a physical one. And all of these things are extremely important. And the moment you start removing elements of that, the value of individuals actually goes down, right? The value of people actually goes down. And that's why it's a problem. Not just that, what does zina lead to? It leads to children out of wedlock, yes? And most crimes are committed by who? By children out of wedlock. There's a very clear connection, right? There's a very clear pathway in where that leads and why that leads to societal distrust. The Prophet ﷺ, qawl al-zur, he also mentioned taking false testimony or false witness. Why? Because it goes, again, this reliance on these systems that we have in place. If we can't trust people to make good judgment, if we can't trust people to actually be truthful witnesses, how is it that we'll substantiate when people's rights are being taken? Like this idea of personal rights or something that are really important, right? It's really fundamental to Islam, that we're able to protect our individual rights and to protect our personal rights. طيب, I think we'll take... So the last part of the hadith we had talked about is أَلَا نَبِّئُكُم بِأَكْبَرِ الْكَبَائِرِ. Shall I not tell you about the greatest kaba'ir or the greatest evil deeds? قَالَ قَوْلُ الزُّورِ, right? To make or take false testimony. أو قَالَ شَهَادَةُ الزُّورِ, or take false witness. قَالَ شُعْبَةُ, and Shu'bah is one of the narrators. He says وَأَكْبَرُ ظَنِّي أَنَّهُ شَهَادَةُ الزُّورِ, and he said that to me, I believe that bearing false witness is the greatest sin. قال مصنف رحمه الله تعالى قال حدثني هارون بن سعيد الأيلي قال حدثنا ابن وهب قال أخبرني سليمان بن بلال أن ثور بن زيد أن أبي الغيث أن أبي هريرة أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال اجتنبوا السبع الموبقات. So over here the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, stay away from the 7 destructive deeds. قيل يا رسول الله وما هن? He says, it was said, O Messenger of Allah, and what are those? قال الشرك بالله, to share partners with Allah, والسحر, and magic, وقتل النفس, and murder, التي حرم الله إلا بالحق, is basically taking the life without due, وأكل مال يتيم, and to eat the wealth of the orphan, or to consume the wealth of the orphan, وأكل riba, and consuming riba, وتولي يوم الزحف, and over here it says that to be accountable on the day of judgment for these things, وقذف المحصنات الغافلات المؤمنات, and to accuse those women who are pure and chaste, of committing adultery or falling into adultery. So over here, shirk billah is something that's shared. A sihr, magic. We had talked a little bit about magic before. Over here, it's not just magic, it is the actual what? Not just intention, it's the actual practicing of magic. And there is a difference of opinion on what concerning magic? Learning it, right? So there's a difference of opinion on actually learning magic. Why is there a difference of opinion?
I think last time you said if you like constant, as an imam, you should know what.
Sure. So learning it to recognize, right? To recognize that this is magic that's being practiced, and this is what there's khilaf over. Right? Not practicing magic is agreed upon that that is evil and that is a major sin. وَقَتَلْ النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ, and to kill an individual except that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed. In those instances, what are those instances where it is allowed? Right, zina? Murder, qatl, and apostasy. Right, so these are the 3 that are mentioned why they should. Or if an individual is defending himself, right? Or if an individual is defending himself, these are the situations on where the death penalty is applied. Then the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions وَأَكْلْ مَالْ يَتِيم. Why is that important? Right. The orphans are like a very vulnerable sector of society. Why? Right, they don't have anyone to defend them. Right, there's no one to stand up for them. There's no one to help them get their rights or receive their rights. And orphans are children, right? Orphans are children. They have no inability. There's no one to support them. So taking their wealth is in them specifically because there's no way for them to what? To fight for their right, right, and to get that right back. So and this can be applied to taking advantage of any weak members of society, right, or any vulnerable population. وَأَكْلُ الرِّبَا. So.
Child an orphan until puberty, or?
No, I mean, a child will always be an orphan. It's just that once he becomes an adult, or once she becomes an adult, it's easier for them to defend themselves and to stand up for their rights.
What the Islamic definition is until?
Yeah, I mean, they'll always, the moment that their father dies, right, they're going to be considered an orphan because there's no one to stand up for them, and there's no one to defend them. But the necessary care that's required, obviously, as they get older, it's less. وأكل الربا. طيب riba. It's an interesting subject. What is it? What is wrong with it? What is it? Number one, I think that's something that's really important. And number two, right? So you're already causing problems, right? So what is riba? Right, that's something that's important. And number two, why is it a problem? Okay, right, so it's exploitative. That's something that's really important. So what is the nature of riba? What does it look like?
Adding up the money occasionally.
Oh, okay, so if they're in unequal amounts are traded, right? So if someone comes to me and says, okay, can I borrow $100? And I'm like, sure, but you have to give me back 105. Like that? Okay. Does that apply to all types of currency? So, for example, is it the same if I borrow 10 grams of gold from you and give back 10 grams? Is it the same as if I borrowed $10 and I gave back 10? Are those, do we deal with those in the same way? Yes? Okay. Anyone know? There's khilaf. There's actually valid khilaf on this issue. And the reason is gold and silver are considered what we call commodity currencies. And dollars, yen, ruble, etc. These are all fiat, right? They're all fiat currencies. What is the difference between commodity and fiat currency? One's inflationary. Meaning what? So if I can use 10 grams of gold to buy a hamburger, for example, in 10 years, is that hamburger going to be 11 or 12 grams of gold?
Most likely.
Most likely not. It's going to be the same. An example of this is gold versus oil. There hasn't been, like 40 years, 50 years now, there hasn't really been a shift. And I can still purchase the same amount of oil for gold that I could 50 years ago, the same amounts.
Explain.
Because the value of the gold hasn't changed.
I mean,
But 50 years ago, how much was a barrel of oil? I don't know, $2 or something. I don't remember. I mean, I wasn't even alive, so granted I'm old. But you versus today, how much do you think it's more or the same? Significantly more. Why? Because oil is more valuable now? So there's more oil now than there was 50 years ago. So just by a simple law of supply and demand, the oil should be what? So it should be cheaper, right? Because there's more oil. And the demand, it's about equal, right? So they can push out as much oil as they need to. So the question then comes, okay, well, what is the difference between the two?
The depreciation in the value of money.
It's actually the actual money that's depreciating. Like what's happening to the ruble now, right? It's getting, we call it weaker, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's in the price is now inflationary. Why? Because you can just print more money. Like just very honestly, right? In order for me to decrease the value of something, what do? I make more of it. And because money is something that can be printed, the value can always be adjusted and always be played with. And there's, like I said, there's khilaf. What is the khilaf over? The khilaf is, does riba apply to amounts or does it apply to value? And that's where it boils down to. The second part of it is like, is it oppressive? Right? We said that it's exploitative and it's oppressive. All right, what if we live in a society that actually has multiple safety nets for a person to not be exploited? Do the same rules apply? Inshallah, we'll talk about it next week. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu ala khayri khalqi nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sallam. Huh?
That's important.
Right. That's it. It's a good discussion. I think it's important to always have perspective on things and understand both sides of arguments.